Over the last decade, we've become more aware as a society of the impact of traumatic brain injury, whether it's from sports or war or an accident. We've learned that a blow to the head can cause lasting memory loss, difficulty thinking, attention deficit, and mood swings. A stroke, a blood clot in the brain, can lead to personality changes. And infections in other regions of the body, particularly in elderly people, can cause episodes of mental confusion. Pain in the body can dominate the mind, making it hard to pay attention to anything else, making us cranky, emotional, and even depressed. Although we either are our bodies or we inhabit them, or both somehow, much of our bodies is hidden from us. Some of what's hidden can be uncovered in an anatomy lab. Scientists have learned a lot about the heart and the nervous system, for example. And over the last decade and a half, we've made such enormous advances in brain science that President Obama has compared the mapping of the brain to the space race of the 1960s. And he launched a $300 million project called the Brain Initiative. And yet, we have not solved the mystery of human thinking, much less how it adds up to what we call the mind. By the mind, I mean consciousness, perception, memory, thinking, and judgment. It's the collection of those things that enable you to say, I am, to regard yourself as though there were two parts to you, the body and the mind that contemplates the body. Is the mind the same as the body? If so, how can it contemplate in such a way as though it were separate? And they really can feel separate. You might not think about it most of the time, especially when things are going pretty well for you, but when your body runs into problems like a severe injury or illness, suddenly it can start to feel like a prison for the mind. And then there are out-of-body experiences. Has anybody had one of those? There's a lot of hands going up right now. I have too. I have twice. Seriously, during childbirth. Birth is such an intense physical event that sometimes women experience the distinct feeling of watching themselves from outside their bodies. We would have been hearing a lot more about this over the ages if more ministers had been women. There would be whole theological treatises on it. It's wild. And it makes you wonder about the mind-body connection. Can the mind decide to get up and go? Is it an illusion? How connected are they? It's the question of the ages, so vexing to philosophers that it's often referred to as the hard problem, with a capital H, as in the permanently impossible problem. However, brain science is making such amazing advances that we just may figure it out. I'm going to talk about that a little bit this morning. First, I want to say that there's a lot of pseudoscience out there when it comes to brains and consciousness and minds. Some of it lends itself really well to sermons. I probably could have prepared in about half the time if I'd gone with it. But when you prop up theology on shaky facts, you get something that falls apart pretty fast later. I'm interested in the kind of theology that we can really carry with us and use and develop some more all throughout our lives. Not a thin spirituality, but a brave one and a rich one, adaptive and reflective and grounded in experience and knowledge. For this sermon, I've drawn largely from the work of neuroscientist Christoph Koch. He is the chief scientific officer at the Allen Institute for Brain Science in Seattle. His work is published in peer-reviewed journals. He spent 16 years studying consciousness with Francis Crick, a Nobel Prize winner, and his most recent book was published by MIT. Koch has made a special focus of the study of consciousness in his career, and all because of a toothache, he says. He was lying in bed one night, having already taken some aspirin, and he couldn't sleep because of the throbbing in his mouth. If it had been me, I probably just would have done some more binge watching of The Walking Dead. But this is a neuroscientist, so, he comforts himself by totally geeking out. He distracts himself by mentally mapping out how the pain is working in his body. He writes, I knew that an inflammation of the tooth pulp sends electrical activity up one of the branches of the trigeminal nerve. which ends in the brainstem. After passing through further relays, nerve cells in part of the neocortical gray matter just beneath the skull become active and discharge their electrical impulses. Such bioelectrical activity goes hand in hand with the consciousness of pain, including its awful feeling. But wait, he writes, something profoundly inexplicable just happened. How can activity in the brain trigger feelings? How can anything physical give rise to something non-physical, to subjective states? The contrast fascinates him. There's the brain, this mass of gray matter subject to the laws of physics, one of the most complex things ever studied. And then there is, as Koch puts it, the world of awareness, of the sights and sounds of life, of fear and anger, of lust, love, and ennui. Brain tissue from humans and animals is practically indistinguishable under a microscope, yet humans have a distinctly different level of consciousness. We speak and think and write in language. We create skyscrapers and the internet and cronuts. While philosophy has hit a wall with explaining consciousness, neuroscientists have made some incredible discoveries. Neuroscientists found that neurons, sophisticated cells that act like little processors, receive and broadcast data to other nerve cells. They do this by sending electrical or chemical transmissions through dendrites, and more specifically, through the structures called synapses that are all over the dendrites. You guys with me? It's okay. If you don't know all these terms, you'll still get the gist of it. The chemical or the electrical signal crosses from the synapse over the synaptic gap where it's picked up by another nerve cell or neuron. Imagine 85 billion of those cells, 85 billion neurons with 85 trillion synapses. So you've got essentially this matrix of neurons in your brain just firing and firing away. That's where consciousness happens. It's what Koch calls the habitat of consciousness. It's so hard to imagine how data being processed by neurons and crossing synaptic gaps leads to thoughts. How does that translate into me picturing my husband's face and being filled with feelings of love for him? How does it turn into an idea, perhaps an idea about the mind itself, such as philosophers and neuroscientists have? How does it turn into a memory? No one knows yet. But the functional MRI makes it possible to measure the activity of brain cells while a person is thinking. Wherever neurons are active, blood flow also increases. That's what an MRI can see. Now, it's worth noting that consciousness is different from the mind. Consciousness is awareness and thinking. The mind is this, and it's memories and judgment and meaning, and a lot of things of which we are unconscious. When I lived in Oregon, I used to run in a forested park where it wasn't unusual for gardener snakes to slither across the path. They're quick, but not dangerous, and apparently not very smart, because they would pass right under my feet. But I never once stepped on one. My unconscious mind was too quick for it. As soon as a snake-like shape appeared on the path, I was jumping. I'd be in midair before I even realized why. About half the time, it turned out I'd jumped over a stick. But the warning mechanism in my brain caused me to act first, sort it out later, especially with snake shapes. Of course, if I'd been looking for snakes, if I'd been paying attention, I would have been more aware of them. But the unconscious mind can also process information that we have no idea we're seeing. Koch gives the example of people with face blindness. People with face blindness think that all faces look pretty much the same, and they're unable to recognize even people they love. They don't recognize differences between faces any more than you or I could recognize individual aspen leaves shimmering in 4th of July Canyon. But they may still have an autonomic or automatic brain response to the faces of people they do know. They'll still insist that they don't know who they're looking at, and it seems to be true that they don't know consciously, but images of their brain show an unconscious response that is different from the conscious one. The unconscious mind is active in many areas of our lives. I think some unconscious assumptions were being challenged this week when I traveled back up to the Roundhouse to meet with legislators again, this time with a group from Albuquerque Interfaith. And one of the people in this pretty big group was an 8th grader named Freddie, whose parents immigrated to the US from Mexico. I had enjoyed the chance to talk to Freddie on the bus, and I knew that he was a thoughtful and smart kid, but I didn't know how much courage he had until we were on the Senate floor, and we approached a white, conservative senator, a man of advanced age. Freddie and the rest of the group listened patiently while the senator held forth on school testing with a story from his own childhood, and then Freddie changed the subject. He said he wanted to talk to the senator about licenses for immigrants, and he explained that if his mother lost her driver's license due to her immigration status, she would not be able to drive Freddie to school or to the doctor or go to the store and buy food for the family. The senator looked down and rubbed the top of his head as he pondered this, and I got the distinct impression his mind was changing a little bit. Brain science is making such huge strides, many scientists do think we will eventually solve the mystery of how a physical structure can give rise to the mind, to subjective feelings and experiences. Now here's the thing that gives people the most pause, that scares them. What if it really does all boil down to mechanics? What if the minds we experience as separate really are just the product of a neural network, and we figure it out and we map it and we document its mathematical formulas? If that's the case, who are we? It goes back to another age-old question, another vexing question, the question of free will. Are we really in charge, or are we behaving according to our wiring? Who's driving this bus? Is our sense of self, memories, judgment, and perception an illusion? That's what some people have suggested. That if the mind is not magical, but it obeys the laws of physics, then it's an illusion. Usually we think of magical things as illusions, but in this case, it's the reverse. We've ascribed such magical properties to what we thought of as our minds, and we have worshipped that idea so much that to find out they obey the same laws of physics as everything else around us, it seems, would be to discover that they're not even real. But I think that that's a case of just getting lost in the weeds. Saying that the mind is an illusion because it's made up of neurons, dendrites, neurotransmitters, energy, and other components is like saying cookies are an illusion because they're made of flour, sugar, butter, and eggs. So what? Pass the cookies, right? Or it's like saying that the letter that was sent to Iran last week was an illusion because it was merely the manifestation of the thoughts of 47 pugnacious senators. But that happened. That happened. This is the kind of science that scares some ministers and theologians, and frankly, some scientists, too. There's nothing more disheartening than the thought that we might be reduced to mere parts, behaving precisely as a mathematical formula would predict. If only we could come up with a formula sophisticated enough to do it. But remember that it's not religion's business to define how brains work, or how atoms and asteroids and plant nuclei work, for that matter. Religion should pay attention to those things, but it should not try to solve them by coming up with its own literally true stories, because religion's job is not primarily one of description, but one of interpretation. Why do we need interpretation? Because the purpose of mathematics and MRIs and all science is to help us make sense of lived experience, right? There's no other kind of experience. There's no reality for us to study other than the one we're living in and observing as human beings. Whatever a mind is, we're experiencing it. We're wired to experience the mind, and we're wired to use it for meaning making. And if we are shut down by new discoveries about how minds work, well, we just aren't being very imaginative. In fact, consciousness and meaning making are as real as their mechanisms. They're what sparked all this discovery in the first place. There's no need then to be afraid of looking directly at them. Consciousness, thinking, memory, judgment, perception, and the sense of self are as much a part of the universe as neurons and dendrites and synapses and synaptic gaps. A few weeks ago, at a memorial service held right here in this room, we mourned the loss of a member of this church. David had a keen sense of sacredness and of human history. He brought a scientific mind, the mind of a curious and fascinated observer, to the universe and to the phenomenon of being. He was a collector of many things, including meteorites from every known meteorite strike on the planet, little particles. He collected plants, minerals, elements, pigments, even skulls. And he brought the same sense of observing and studying to his own process of death, kind of like Christopher Koch did with the toothache. What I find so fascinating and beautiful is that David was made of the same atoms, the same oxygen molecules and stardust, energy and cosmic building blocks that so captured his imagination. Through him, it is as though the universe was observing itself. And the same could be said of all of us. Christopher Koch also writes that we are, quote, literally all stardust, brain scientists included. We're all wondering, watching, thinking, loving, and being. Koch often quotes the 20th century scientist and Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, whose approach to science and meaning was part physics, part philosophy. Considered in its full biological reality, Teilhard de Chardin wrote, love, that is to say the affinity of being with being, is not peculiar to humankind. It's a general property of all life. Teilhard de Chardin wrote that we are drawn to each other in love for the same reason that atoms and molecules and the world hold together at all, instead of just dissipating. The charge that holds atoms together is the same as the thing that brings people together, he thought. That's religious imagination. I don't mean that it's imaginary in the not true sense. I mean that it's an example of just the kind of creative interpretation that we are designed to do. Just the kind of interpretation that the universe is designed to do in us. And if you are feeling, as I am, something stirring within you, if these ideas connect with and they awaken something deep inside you, then probably we are engaged not just in thinking interesting thoughts, but in some soulful reflection. For the mind and the soul are closely connected, just as the body and the mind are. What do I mean by soul? That's another sermon. It's the sermon in 2 weeks. The third in this Body, Mind, and Soul series. Blessings.